The Occult War is when the forces of worldwide subversion lead from behind the scenes, adopting means that almost always elude ordinary methods of investigation. The notion of an occult war belongs to a tri-dimensional vision of history, to a history considered not according to the two-dimensional surface of apparent causes, events, and leaders, but otherwise, depending on the third dimension of depth, the subterranean direction that retrieves the decisive forces and influences which are often not even ascribable to the simple human element, whether individual or collective. Having used the adjective subterranean, it is necessary to make precise its importance, indicating that it is not a question of an obscure and irrational substrate of scientific history, of something that could stand in the known part of it, but in the same relationship by which, in the individual, the subconscious stands to the consciousness of waking. This analogy is certainly exact if consider it from the point of view of those who, in this tri-dimensional view of events, appear not as the subjects, but rather of the objects of history. In their acting and thinking, they do not take into account the true influences which they obey and the true ends that are accomplished through them. They have their true center more in the subconscious and unconscious than in their waking consciousness. Yet, in this respect, we can certainly say that it is in the subconscious that the most decisive movements of the occult war develop. But from the point of view of the true subjects of history, things are quite different, and we can speak, in this regard, neither of the subconscious nor the unconscious, but we must think of more than intelligent forces, forces that know perfectly what they want, and the most appropriate means to realize what they want. To suppose that the substrate of history is accounted for by the irrational, by life, by becoming, or by whatever else of those confused entities invented by modern historicism in the moment in which they thought they went beyond so-called scientific historiography, is among the most dangerous errors. We believe, on the contrary, that we see in that one of the suggestions prudently spread in certain circles, typical of the aims of certain movements of the occult war in modern times. We will explain ourselves more clearly in what follows. For now, it is enough to establish this point. We must not allow the third dimension of history to vanish in the fog of abstract and philosophical views, but we must consider it inhabited and occupied by quite precise intelligences whose expression and closest mouthpieces were almost always certain secret societies or organizations, but which must not all exhaust, have their beginning and end in them. The occult war is exercised on that which, with an image drawn from positive science, we will call the imponderables or imponderable quantities. It is adopted fairly often to produce almost insensible changes from which sizable effects will proceed slowly but fatally. It almost never acts with forces opposed to other forces, but rather through an opportune direction of it, so as to lead to the desired effects. What Wundt called the heterogony of ends plays a fundamental part in it. It is precisely about acting while some forces or men believe they are willing and producing a given effect, and it alone, in actuality, they will produce or prepare something else quite different from it, thus uncovering an influence and an intelligence that transcends them. The positivist suggestion. It is necessary to get used to thinking that the so-called positive mode of doing history and of considering events is somewhat less a spontaneous product and prejudice typical of a very limited mentality than a suggestion spread methodically in modern culture by anti-traditional forces with the purpose of covering their action. Whoever believes that history is simply made by men and determined exclusively by economic, political and social factors sees nothing else. And it is exactly such a world that sees nothing else that is needed by whoever wants to act subterraneously. A civilization dominated by the positivistic prejudice offers the ideal condition for an action developing along the third dimension, and this is exactly the case of the current civilization. Above, we mentioned besides positivistic interpretations, those having as their basic abstract ideas of becoming, of life, or even of the spirit. In that, we can consider a case of the application of a second tool of the Occult War, the tactic of the surrogates. It is followed every time that the danger of an awakening is manifested and that the energies seek to turn beyond the plan dominated by ideas, in the operation of which the occult game of the forces of subversion can easily take place. In the case now mentioned, these confused ideas of becoming, life, absolute spirit, etc., in fact, are only a decoy thrown at those no longer satisfied with positivistic patterns and those whose gaze does not bring itself where it should. From the fog of such ideas, the field of action remains so well covered as by the dark night of positivistic agnosticism. The tactic of the surrogates develops, however, in a much more characteristic and effective way. Tactic of falsifying substitution. This is what we are talking about. When the effects of destructive action appearing even on the material plane and giving rise to clearly visible phenomena exhibit a degree hot enough to provoke a reaction, this reaction confusedly seeks symbols and myths to serve as the base for an engine of reconstruction and can also find it legitimate and consistent with its goal. It is almost always about symbols and points of reference that, in their historical aspect, remaining in the traditional past, recalled from atavistic depths through the forces of an organism that feels itself threatened by final destruction. In these cases, the occult war does not take place with a direct action, therefore not by opposing such symbols, but ensures that they do not circulate and are not worth falsifying or counterfeiting, in so much as the reaction either remains limited or diverted or even overturned in an opposite direction on which they naturally move on to apply the same influences present in the evil against which they want to act and in the decadence from which they wanted to rise up from and believed in good faith to be rising up from. This tactic can develop in diverse domains, in the political as well as in the spiritual camp, and seems today to have a totally special efficiency. It is worth indicating an example. The most typical is constituted by traditionalism, the vague aspiration of a return to tradition, therefore to a hierarchical and qualitative order centered in a transcendent spirituality and in elite of its qualified and legitimate representatives, is diverted to in the form of traditionalism, therefore of vague assumptions of dilettantish or militant character that confuses tradition with custom and the routine that lead into a narrow-minded particularism that stop at given handed-down forms and know nothing of their spirit. In such a way, they present an easy game to their adversaries and provide a good decoy to those who, through the false goal of anti-traditionalism, bring their true blow against tradition and foment new developments of revolutionary subversion. So the reaction remains contained and the maneuver leads successfully to pre-arranged goals. What, in certain extremist circles, the idea of race threatens to become because of assumptions in terms of zoological materialism, as so even the Nordic Aryan idea and even the pagan idea come back to a conjecture of the type. It is about ideas that, if they were understood and represented in accordance with their true nature and their ancient spiritual and traditional content, could certainly carry out a creative and healing action within the limits of some peoples of the north, as they appear instead in the circles already indicated, first of all because of lack of principles, then because of a profound incomprehension and deformation of the ancient Aryan world, and finally through the tyranny of immediate interests and irrational impulses, make us suspect the effect of a distorting action of the type indicated. Tactic of reversal. The secret forces of worldwide subversion knew perfectly that the fundamental premise of order to be destroyed was the supernatural element. Spirit conceived not as a philosophical abstraction, but rather as a higher reality and as the means of a process of transcendent integration of the personality. The whole of what it can be called neo-spiritualism, with allusion to the various theosophical, spiritist, orientalizing and occultistic sects, can be considered the effect of one such maneuver. In all that, again, it is a question almost exclusively of deformation, counterfeits, and distortions of spiritual doctrine due to the least qualified persons who, in this respect, seem often to be subjected to a truly demonic influence. The consequent outcome is twofold. First of all, it provided an easy way of extending the general discredit into which those counterfeits had to fall to the doctrines in themselves, with which they were practically put in condition of no longer damaging. We can mention that in recent times the maneuver has even employed political factors, and there are some circles that, in good faith, are able to see only masonry wherever one speaks of secret associations, of esoteric symbols, even when such references lead back to ancient traditions whose original spirit and aristocratic nature everyone should note. In the second place, because of poorly understood theories and false practices, they are joined to channel all the forces constricted by the suffocating stranglehold of materialism and yearning for something extra-natural, not toward the supernatural, but rather toward the supernatural, therefore the subconscious, mediumship, and in general toward a world that, far from representing an integration of the personality, can only propitiate its collapse and disintegration, as much by making of it the tool of some of the darkest influences. So with neo-spiritualism, the danger constituted by true spirituality was contained and reduced to an almost inessential minimum. Tactic of the ricochet attack. It consists in provoking one of the forces to be torn down because of their still traditional character to undertake an action that initially was aimed against a similar force and apparently of value to strengthen and increase the first force, but that then ricochets against it, dragging it down into the same ruins that it had propitiated against the other. By means of timely infiltrations, the secret forces of worldwide subversion often incite the representatives of a tradition to defend it through the discrediting another. Whoever is subject to such a maneuver does not notice that to attack the tradition in the person of another people or civilization for particularistic reason or contingent and inferior interests means to be condemned to see itself attacked sooner or later in their own home through a ricochet motion. The forces of worldwide subversion very much count on this tactic, and therefore make every effort to put every higher idea under the subjection of particularistic interests, pride, ambitions, and proletarian tendencies. They know that this is the best means to destroy every unity and true solidarity and to propitiate a state of division in which their game will be extremely easy. In this case, one can also allow every Machiavellian utilization of revolutionary forces back in. Some statesmen of scant discernment believed that propitiating or helping the revolution in the nations unfavorable to them was the best means to sustain and defend their true interests. Without realizing it, they prepared the exact opposite result. While they believed they served the revolution like an instrument, they themselves became tools of the revolution, which had to reach them after having passed over the body of their adversaries. We can say that the entire history of modern times, above all starting from the French Revolution, was the theater of a subversion that tragically worked in such a way. We can never insist enough, in such regard, on the fact that only the absolute, ascetic, unfaltering adherence to an idea can serve to safeguard against the forces of the occult war. Wherever this standard is abandoned and follows contingent factors, the front of the resistance is broken, and with it, the possibility of a true autonomy. Tactic of the scapegoat. When the hidden forces of worldwide subversion avoid the danger of being unmasked in some of their aspects, they see to it that all the attention of their adversaries is directed and concentrated on some elements that only in part or only subordinately can be considered as responsible for their evil doing. All the reaction is then unloaded on such elements, becoming the true scapegoats, and the hidden forces remain free to pursue their game, their adversaries believing they have at this point identified the enemy and do not have to look for others. We repeatedly admonish certain extremists to remain well attentive, so that in their seeing the Mason everywhere, they do not end up by making themselves victims of a trap of that type. It is necessary to guard against every unilateralism, never forgetting the complex plan of the occult forces which we must combat. Tactic of dilution. This is a particular case of the tactic of substitution. To understand it, it is necessary to start from the idea that the process that led us up to our current general crisis had distant origins and various phases, and that in each one of such phases, corresponding to specific forms of civilization, state, ethics, etc., the crisis was already present, even in a less acute, more dilute potential form rather than actual. The theory of progress or evolutionism can be considered as another of the suggestions hurled by the subversive hidden forces into the general environment in order to distract anyone from looking from the perspective of the origins and always pushing well beyond the process of falling under the thrust of false mirages and, above all, of that of the conquests of the technical mechanical civilization. However, the hard experience of tragic events in recent times saw to it that such a hypnosis was no longer able to conserve its efficacy and was no longer able to prevent many spirits from recognizing that the presumed curse toward progress was a curse toward the abyss and that a going back was imposed. The hidden front then put into notion every means to prevent any radicalism. One of the preferred methods was, above all, putting a prejudice against anachronism into circulation, against that which is no longer adapted for the times, and then directing the forces that return to look toward the origins, toward one or the other of those preceding phases in which the crisis and evil were found in forms less advanced and, for that very reason, less visible, and even this trap had success. The leaders of worldwide subversion know naturally that having come to that point, the danger is eliminated because the whole was reduced to soon retrace the same path and to push, at the end of it, to dissolution even these forces that were awakened and that wanted to react and pull back. We could also indicate many historical examples of this tactic, both recently and further in the past. Above all, the political leaders of current anti-subversive movements should not lose it from view. Let us say, in all frankness, since in such a field a lack of frankness is certainly equivalent to a fault, there are aspects of contemporary nationalism that would merit being tested thoroughly. Anyone can note, in fact, the anti-traditional, anti-hierarchical, revolutionary character that, in the past, compared to the preceding ecumen, imperial and feudal civilization had the notion of nation. Now, it is the nation that today predominantly challenges to combat the extreme forms of the crisis and subversion, represented by various red internationals. There is therefore the necessity to formulate a concept of the nation different from that which makes of it a stage of the path that had to lead to what today we must combat. Tactic of the substitution of principle to the person. It is undeniable that, in many respects, the decadence of traditional institutions occurs through the decadence of their leaders and representatives. But this is not the only cause. In order to come to a true dissolution and involution, it is necessary that the tactic of the substitution of principle to the person be added to it, a new tool of the occult war, which works in the following way. When the representative of a given principle appears unworthy, a process against the principle in itself is set in motion in the person of this representative, or the process is extended from the person to the principle. They do not come to the conclusion that that representative does not measure up to the principle and must therefore be substituted with another person who can really represent it, but instead they go on to say that the principle itself is false or harmful and must be substituted with another principle. In how many cases does the attack against this or that degenerate, vain, or vicious aristocrat get translated into the attack against the very aristocratic principle in itself and into a tool of demagogy? Again, history is rich with episodes of the type, equivalent to many other moments of the worldwide subversion. Let us remember that the ancient hierarchical system was constituted by a spiritual authority under which stood the warrior aristocracy, then a bourgeois caste, and then the working masses. The fall of this traditional system, in many of its aspects, had as its instrument the tactic here indicated. The warrior aristocracy rose up against the decadent representatives of the pure spiritual authority, not through substituting them with another, more worthy representatives of the same principle, but by drawing from that the pretense to be emancipated or lay claim for itself the supreme authority. In the following phase, therefore, in a following civilization, the third estate rises up against the degenerate warrior aristocracy, not because it ceded the place to the true aristocrats, but to seize power for itself. In yet another phase, the process against capitalism and the bourgeois, in its destructive and negative aspects, does not aim for a corresponding reform, but is only the excuse for the revolt of the proletariat and the usurpation of power, descending progressively from step to step, straight through to the party of the proletariat. Conclusion. The fact that, for reasons of space, we only indicated some examples and we were concerned above all with the exposition of the principles Not to prevent, we hope, seeing what vast fields of application these principles can have, and to that valuable results it could reach those who, adequately equipped, can apply them methodically in any field. Since one can assert without uncertainty that there is not a single area in which the occult battle of the forces of worldwide subversion are not in any developed way, and indeed, these areas that would seem more unrelated to events of the type are those that, by principle, should be considered with the greatest wariness. We repeat one more time that it is not a question of philosophical positions, but of things much more real, and that there is no leader or combatant at the front of the counter-subversion and the tradition that can be called mature and at the peak of its true tasks. Before having developed in itself the faculty of seeing clearly in this subterranean world of cause and of indicating quickly the action of this or that invisible tool which our enemy does not cease to adopt in every epoch, that, like the current one, sounding the prelude to the moment of final decision and the final battle of all, a cycle of civilization.